and I hope you'll bear with me. I've never done this before, and I've got my fingers crossed that everything will go fine. I know with my guests that you're going to enjoy the information you're about to receive. I've got Connie Cummey, who is the premier expert on the New Age movement. She wrote the first book that kicked all of the other books off, or spin-offs, of Connie's original research, and we're so privileged to have her here. My second guest is Jed Brown, who is an educator and a scholar and an expert in the education reform movement and what is going on, its history, and all the little details that you've been wondering about. The subject tonight is the paradigm shift. President Clinton talked about the bridge to the 21st century, and we're going to look at what's on the other side of that bridge and how long they've known what's on the other side. Why didn't they tell us what was on the other side? And I'd like to tell you how I came on this information. I had picked out of my library the Aquarian Conspiracy that was written in 1980 by Marilyn Ferguson, and found that she discussed the politics of the radical center and made some descriptions about things that we're seeing in politics right now, where conservatives are taking what would have been traditionally liberal standpoints as far as trade goes, and liberals are taking other standpoints, and they're all meeting in the New Age Radical Center, where you have the Conservative Heritage Foundation and all the conservatives pushing charter schools, and President Clinton endorsing charter schools in his last inauguration speech. In religion, you've got the radical center of spiritual experience that seems to be knowing without doctrine. And we see that a great deal within the Christian community, where divisions, if you argue about doctrine, you're supposed to be causing disunity. In the Promise Keeper movement, doctrine divides people, therefore they don't like to discuss doctrine. Anyway, that is Marilyn Ferguson's Aquarian Conspiracy viewpoint, and she references in her book a policy study from the Stanford Research Institute that was written in 1974 at the behest of the Department of Education. And that book is called The Changing Images of Man. And The Changing Images of Man says that society will be undergoing a radical transformation. And it describes successful models for that transformation. And it's my belief that this book is a blueprint for why we need the bridge to the 21st century. They're calling for increased spirituality and many things that play into what has been legislated in our education system. And interestingly enough, yet another book written by a man who's a historian by the name of William Irwin Thompson wrote a book called Evil and World Order. And this man is a historian who taught at Columbia University. He says some things that I agree with. And in Chapter 5 of his book, he references again Stanford Policy Research Institute's Changing Images of Man study, and suggests that the best model to follow into the 21st century is Findhorn. And Connie, are you there?
I'm here.
I would like to find out what a historian at Columbia University would find going on at Findhorn that would fit so beautifully for the 21st century. Could you tell us a little bit about Findhorn and what's going on over there?
Well, the Findhorn community in northern Scotland was a pioneering intentional community, and the intentional communities were experiments in the establishment of structures for the New Age. They were considered by the New Agers to be kind of like the equivalent of monasteries and convents in the Catholic Church, that they would be cells that would kind of radiate this light outwards, and that they would kind of hatch the culture and experiment with various models for the culture. For example, group consciousness, which was supposed to be the mode of the New Age, and they would experiment with guidance and various community modalities and various ways of supporting themselves in their endeavors. And they basically would have that as an incubator for the New Age while the society at large was warming up to the concept. Findhorn was not the only one. There was one in India. There was, Shay, we have a horrible buzzing. I don't know if you can hear it on your end or not.
I can hear it just
But it's like a high scream. I was thinking that maybe if the engineer replaced the call that might go away.
Okay, maybe Mike could do that.
That would be, I could picture a migraine if we go much further with that. It's just right at that frequency. The New Agers couldn't have programmed it better themselves. But basically, the intentional communities were to lead the way forward. And another intentional one was in Stella community in Illinois. And there's a great path.
Connie, excuse me, we're coming up on a break. Maybe you can hang up and call back on that other number. And get
sure. Your engineer may want to place it to me however it works best.
The Millennium Bug in the year.
This is Shay Simonton filling in for Chuck Morris tonight. Our guests are Constance Cumby and Jed Brown. We're talking about the paradigm shift that is occurring in our society, what will be happening in the 21st century, and all the disparate things that are going on in our world that are leading us to this. Some of the deceptions, some of the philosophies and the mindsets that we're dealing with. Constance, you were telling us about Findhorn and the demonstration communities.
Right. We didn't make much of a paradigm shift on the noise.
Oh, is it still a bad connection?
I don't know if it's the connection. Your engineer and I were trying to sort it out on the break. The phone connection was beautiful. Apart from one on the air.
Maybe you can hang up and call in on a different line.
Yeah, we tried that. This is a different line.
Okay, he was going to do yet another line.
Okay, he might want to place one to me on one of your different lines. That might.
Yeah, and I'll just talk for a little bit. I've got a lot of quotes to take out of these books.
Real good, Shay.
Okay.
Connie, if you'll just hold on a second, I'll pick you up here in just a second.
Okay, thank you.
All right. In the Aquarian Conspiracy, highly urge people to find a copy. They're in all the used bookstores. You can pick one up for practically nothing. It basically is a verification, if you're interested in researching this, of what is going on. She examines all the brain research that supposedly is leading this. She goes into a lot of the spiritual enlightenment that came out of the 60s LSD experiments that many of those people who were whacked out on LSD for a number of years have greater insight and have become gurus who are advising us all now, all of us foolish people who didn't do that. One thing that you may need to know about the power of the radical center, and the radical center is where both left and right and all gradations meet in the center and agree, they form a consensus, is a term that you may have heard before, out of the UN and various global organizations. It's called Unity in Diversity. And she says politicians of the radical center are easily misunderstood and unusually vulnerable to attack, regardless of their accomplishments, because they don't take strident positions. They have a high tolerance for ambiguity, and their willingness to change their minds leaves them open to accusations of being arbitrary, inconsistent, uncertain, or devious. But she says the radical center will be a viable point of view, to be constantly in flux and change your mind. And it saddens me to say I've seen conservative Christians take some very bizarre tacks as legislators, voting for things they absolutely know that their constituents are against. And it's very disturbing. The Careers Act in 1995 is the one that most prominently comes to mind. Also the charter schools business, as I said, which is really an unconstitutional system that has had the support of conservatives who embrace the Constitution, yet want a completely different system of finance and education. In her book, she references Jerry Brown as the quintessential radical center politician, where he actually said, and I quote, "We're going to go left and right at the same time." So we're living in a very strange time, and the bridge is getting closer. And if Connie, are you back?
I'm back, and it seems like we're remarkably clear of your engineer is very brilliant.
Oh, he is.
Remarkably clear of the buzz.
That's great. Well, what we want to go back and look in the... It's interesting to me that these demonstration communities all came up in the 60s, the time of the drug culture.
There were some that were even older
that.
than the 60s. There were actually, this movement has been building extremely seriously in the United States and globally since probably the serious organization starting about 1910. From 1875 to 1910, they were also building, but there were many intentional communities that arose in the 20s and the 30s, and many experiments that
now, would Oneida, some of those be in that category?
Well, one would be Graylville in Ohio, which started in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And was built as a women's group. It's a New Age intentional community. And they were playing an interesting game of working the Catholic Church and the women's movement simultaneously with them. There were a number of other groups that came from New Agers who blended with some liberal Catholics, and some of your famous nutritionists was involved in one of them, Adele Davis, and I've grown on that because I suffered through many of her recipes as a child. My mother was completely taken with her notions, and I must confess, I went and showed my mother with some glee that it was Adele Davis who led Ruth Montgomery into believing in reincarnation.
Oh, boy.
And this was an intentional community that was formed by a number of these folks back in the 40s and 50s. There are a number of them. Findhorn was probably the most overtly esoteric, and that's what distinguishes Findhorn.
Okay, now, what I found when I looked at this book, Evil and World Order, is William Irwin Thompson, the historian, actually has an organization based in New York called Lindisfarne, which I would expect is yet another one of those types of communities.
Well, Lindisfarne is actually an outgrowth of the Findhorn movement. And William Irwin Thompson and David Spangler are very close friends, and when they were talking about their monastery concept in Scotland, they started looking at some communities that were next door to it. And Lindisfarne, I guess, was a monastery that was over in the Scottish area. And William Irwin Thompson went to a number of David Spangler seminars and came back with his concept of the Lindisfarne
Now you realize
Foundation.
that I'm based in Seattle, Washington, and David Spangler is just over the hill in the next town of Issaquah.
Issaquah, yes,
yeah,
he is.
So we have quite a flourishing New Age community here.
Oh, lucky you. Okay,
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're not immune from it.
Oh, well,
we have Marianne Williamson who moved here, and
we've got Ramsa just down the road a piece, right down by the state capitol. So she's focusing her energy.
She's still down at Yale.
Yeah. But I'll tell you what concerns me. It doesn't, when I see New Agers acting like New Agers and expressing New Age beliefs, there's nothing surprising in that. What bothers me and the deception to me is when biblical believing people of faith, professing Jews and Christians, cross over and find common ground and start introducing New Age concepts and mingling, particularly for Christians. I mean, we're specifically told by, John, not to even bid them Godspeed, or we're partakers of their evil deeds. And in the Old Testament, Balaam, purposely advised to introduce the pagans, with the Jews in order to corrupt them, so that God would curse them rather than bless them.
Exactly.
So,
he told them to lead them into sexual sin, and then God would have to remove his blessing.
And yet, I know there are instances that have been fairly frequent of highly profile Christian leaders meeting secretly, really.
Well, I've found it very fascinating, and the more I've looked at this and the longer I've looked at this, I'm convinced it was much deeper and wider than I ever had any notion. That A, it was probably 10 times bigger than I believed when I started, and B, they believed I knew 10 times what I really knew. And the more I have reflected on this, the more I've wondered if this isn't the second or third generation of this. When I started, I thought it was very simple. I thought it was we versus them. And it wasn't quite that simple. Many of them became us. And many of us showed their cards that they were probably with them all along. And it was just very interesting to see where the opposition came from. Many New Agers repented even at a very high level and fled the New Age movement as though they had seen the devil himself. They turned their back on it completely. The only threat I've ever had to my face was from the senior editor of a major evangelical publishing house and a campus organization. And he threatened me with character assassination back in March of 1983 if I didn't leave the New Age movement alone.
Really?
And that was after unsuccessfully trying to have a TV special I was doing on the movement canceled. And I thought he was a pretty good guy until I got that threat from him, and I will never forget it. I finally said, he told me I would be attacked by leaders of real stature in the Christian world, that men of great fame would attack me. And I said to him, I said, Jim, I don't care if nobody stands with me on this one but God. And he said so sneeringly, I will not forget until my dying day, he said, God may be all you'll have left.
Really?
Now, the first line of defense against my work was to say the New Age movement didn't exist. And the so-called cult experts were out there saying that this thing didn't exist. I remember Walter Martin from Christian Research Institute said on one well-known program that the only New Age movement that existed was the space between Constance Cumby's ears.
Oh, my goodness.
And that he also said that his friend John Warwick Montgomery had researched this for years and had never found any of this, inferring that if it existed, then certainly John Warwick Montgomery would have found it and sounded the alarms. The second line of defense against me was to call their own conferences. Well, the first thing they did was invite me to a conference in early December 1983 in California and invite me to present my proofs that the New Age movement existed. And it was an attempted roast, and it backfired. So then they held a conference at the Denver Seminary on March, it was the Ides of March of 1985. And they brought in a rank New Ager who's a big-time supporter of the Ramtha cult, J. Gordon Melton. And
I've got one of his books here. It's on cults, and he describes cults, and I've just learned that he actually defends cults.
He is a participant observer himself, and one of the things that he is the most taken with now that he thinks is true enlightenment for our time is J.Z. Knight and the Ramtha cult. But they brought him on board to present a paper called A Christian Response to the Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow. And incidentally, security guards were hired for that conference, contrary to the Pasantino's representations, to keep me out. And I have the policeman who was hired for that job was a Denver policeman by the name of Mark Ragaman, who was hired to be director of security for that conference. And he was summoned into Dr. Gordon Lewis's office at the Denver Seminary and told his first, foremost, and primary responsibility was to escort Constance Cumby off the grounds should she appear. And Mark protested. That's how the cults operate. He was told, you want the job, that's the condition. He decided to stick around, see what else they had up their collective sleeve. And it was a miracle I learned of that. And I learned of it directly from the horse's mouth.
The Denver Seminary, is that attached to any particular... Conservative Baptist.
CB. It's a big CB seminary in Denver, Colorado. And they held that conference with J. Gordon Melton and the Evangelical Ministries to New Religions. And that took place in March of 1985.
We'll be right back. We're back, America. This is Shay Simonton sitting in for Chuck Morse tonight. Our guest is Constance Cumby, and she's relating to us a conference, supposedly a New Age Christian conference at Denver Seminary in the mid-'80s, and that she was such a dangerous character that they hired a security guard strictly to bar her from the door. And
this was presented as an evangelical conference to fight the New Age movement. That was what the mode of deception was.
Well,
People were sucked into it thinking it was something to fight the New Age. It was really something to fight an honest definition of the New Age.
You know, I bought a book. I haunt used bookstores, and I get a lot of... My library is very bizarre. But there was a man named... Is it Grotius or
Grotius?
That was supposedly from a Christian university in Oregon, who wrote a little sweet book about how the New Age movement was just kind of everybody thinking alike and all these ideas coming together. And he said that you had gotten off on the wrong track and brought a lot of evil to it. That
he was
really
published by
belong.
the very company that gave me the threat to back off the New Age movement. InterVarsity Publishing.
I had read his book, your book first, and it is totally convicting, particularly looking at the Nazi and occult ties to it and the theosophical ties. And he did not address any of the issues that I would expect any solid...
Well, his job was to give disinformation, I'm afraid, not information.
He did that, and I must say that your integrity is won in the long run. I listen to David Jeremiah on the radio every morning, and when he did his New Age series, he did quote you.
Well, that's nice to know.
Very frequently as his source on a lot of things.
Okay, well, that's very encouraging. I hadn't known that because I wasn't mentioned in his book as best I known, so I'm glad to know that at least I had a little credit, albeit somewhere.
Well, now, we've got, like, people that are so prominent in the New Age movement, Barbara Marx Hubbard and people of that level,
Well, that was the second conference. from many of the same folks that were at the first. And Gordon Lewis, again, was a participant in this one, and Regent College up in Vancouver, British Columbia, and even somebody from the Dallas Seminary. And that conference took place at the Gold Lake Ranch Conference Center in October 1987, and it was organized by evangelicals, and Barbara Marks Hubbard chaired that conference at the invitation of the evangelicals.
Oh.
In fact, that, I submit, was your real harmonic convergence, not the exercise that was held a couple months earlier on August 16th and 17th.
And presumably all of those evangelicals had read the second epistle of John.
I'm sure.
And chose to ignore it.
Right. Well, if the New Agers hadn't gone out and bragged about what happened, we may never have learned the truth. But David Spangler gave a talk at an Episcopal church immediately upon the conclusion of this, and some alert Christians in Boulder mailed the tapes to me promptly. And David Spangler boasted about this conference, and the director of the Findhorn Foundation, the educational director, I believe a young man by the name of Francois Decaine, something like that, I may be butchering his name, said how wonderful and how inspiring it was, just saying we are one in the Spirit with his separated Christian brethren.
Oh, my goodness. And we have to remember that David Spangler wrote the global planetary initiation thing, didn't? And there he was.
Yes.
Oh. And were these, and I know you may not want to mention names, but the evangelicals that participated, what we have
I
to...
don't mind mentioning names.
Well, what I'm getting into is that is the Radical Center. When you have evangelical Christians meeting with major New Agers and bridging that gap.
Yes, exactly.
That is exactly the Radical Center in that. Now, what I'm finding is, as the Christian right grew up as a political phenomenon, you found those types of people that were reaching out to the New Age, inviting them in.
You know, the biggest
were also the political ones that were getting involved in politics.
The biggest thing in the Christian right, what I would really call the Christian right, and the biggest bridge between the New Age has been the links between the Christian right and Unification Church. Now, Unification Church is part of the New Age mainstream.
And that is my hot button issue. You've hit a chord with me, yes. Reverend Moon, in one of his books published by his publisher, Paragon House, claims to have funded the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 93.
I'm sure he was a major source of that.
He also publishes the World Scriptures.
And he also claims to be the Lord of the Second Advent, the true Messiah.
And he claims in his book, too, that Korea is the new Israel on this day of Rosh Hashanah. That's just horrible to even say.
There was a very interesting expose of his personal and family life, which he said is the true sinless family, last night on 60 Minutes, when both his daughter-in-law and one of his courageous daughters spoke out against him.
I taped that one, yes.
I did too.
Boy, that's a keeper. I would like to get her book, bless her heart.
Yes, I intend to knock down the doors of the bookstore when it's available to obtain it. But shamefully, many prominent Christians, even some that spoke out against the New Age, had no problems networking with Reverend Moon. And they rationalized it by saying it was okay to take Unification Church money to build the kingdom of God on earth.
Well, there's that, and you know, I've done several radio interviews about Moon, and on one, it's the only one that I was really attacked on, over naming Beverly LaHaye and Tim LaHaye.
Well, no, Tim LaHaye and I had a fight about Reverend Moon in 1986. We had an out-and-out fight, and I was blacklisted by the LaHayes for this reason.
And Beverly LaHaye spoke at his big conference in 96.
Beverly LaHaye knows exactly what she's doing. Jerry Falwell knows exactly what they're doing. These folks have all helped Reverend Moon gain undeserved respectability.
They've legitimized him, and as I told a friend, Concerned Women for America is the presumption is because he's a pastor and she's a pastor's wife, that it's a Christian organization. They recruit in the churches for membership. However, when she holds her rallies on the steps of Washington, D.C. for family values, which is a unification church term, and you, as an innocent and unsuspecting and trusting Christian, would go to stand on those steps with her. The person,
I wouldn't, because I know where she's coming from. But
all these little sweet mommies from the churches who are concerned over education and all of these issues. You may be standing next to Scientologists and Unification Church members and people. You think you're there to glorify God because that's what they tell you they're there to do, but they're there to glorify L. Ron Hubbard or Reverend Moon. Exactly. And the deception involved in that is incredible, particularly when you get their fundraising letters. And they have had no discernible victories over all these years that they've been doing this. There is nothing that is improved. I truly believe that God is not blessing what they're doing.
Well, I told Tim LaHaye, I said, God doesn't need 25 cents worth of Reverend Moon's money to build his kingdom. And that was the most interesting conversation.
And there you have the politics and religion and in the radical center.
By the way, it came to my attention that Tim LaHaye denied the conversation had ever taken place, and not only did it take place, it took place on his nickel. He's the one who placed the calls.
Well, tell us about that. We'll be right back. Welcome back, America. This is Shay Simonton sitting in for Chuck Morse tonight. Our guests are Constance Cumby, talking about the New Age movement and the paradigm shift of the Radical Center. And in a moment, we'll be joined by Jed Brown, who is going to explain the paradigm shift in terms of politics and the Radical Center and education, where our children are being led across this bridge to the 21st century. But Constance, first you were going to tell us about Tim LaHaye.
Well, Mr. LaHaye introduced himself, Reverend LaHaye introduced himself to me at the NRB conference in, I believe, 1984 in Washington, D.C. And then in late 1985, it might have been 85, 86, early 85, it was late, it was early 1984. In 1985, February 1984, he introduced himself to me, and we had a cordial conversation, and he told me he thought the entire problem was secularism. He'd read my book, but he didn't believe the problem was New Age. And we had a cordial conversation about it, and I frankly counted him as kind of a nice guy. And in late 1984, I saw a headline on a magazine that was Mother Jones, and it said the Unification Church and the Christian Right. And since I'd had a very, very hairy experience with the Unification Church people who had made the mistake of inviting me to one of their conferences under one of their front groups called Causa, and I'd quickly sized it up. In fact, I'd figured out what it was before I went. I had found the name referenced in an article saying that Causa was the political action arm of Unification Church, and I figured if they were going to be stupid enough to pay my research costs, I'd check it out. And then they discovered who they'd invited, and they uninvited me in a hurry, keeping me under house arrest in the process. So, needless to say, I was motivated. And just about the time I got home, I had phone calls from a couple of ministers of large Memphis, Tennessee churches telling me about some horror stories, people trying to organize their church who were clearly working with Tim LaHaye on the Coalition for Religious Freedom.
A Moon
Well,
Front group.
Pardon?
A Moon Front
That
group.
was a front group at the time, and they were using Pastor Sullivan as an excuse, and Sullivan did quite knowingly go to make common cause with the Moonies, I'm sorry to say. But at any rate, they, I was watching it very, very closely because of my own experiences and what I was collecting, and the fact that the Unification Church people were active participants in Benjamin Krem's lecture in Detroit in 1981. And so in late 1984, I saw a headline, "The Moonies and the Christian Right." And so, of course, I purchased the magazine and read the article. And the article was all about a tape that the reporter had been given by Beverly LaHaye's public relations director that evidently didn't work. She thought the batteries had failed. I don't think the batteries failed. I think God killed them because there was something extremely vital on that tape that had to be exposed. And what was on the tape was a very long and effusive letter from Tim LaHaye to Bohe Pack, second in command of Unification Church, thanking him for his extremely generous donations, which Tim LaHaye tried to tell me was a series of articles, and I'm sorry, I just don't buy that. But
you know what they would say is, well, Mother Jones is a liberal magazine, and
well,
you know,
Tim
all
LaHaye
those
told me
evil
it was,
liberals.
Yeah, Tim LaHaye told me it was a sleazy left-wing magazine, and I said, Tim, was it true?
And when I
the whole thing up, and he said, it's a sleazy left-wing magazine. I said, was it true? And he reiterated again. He said, it's a left-wing magazine. And I said, Tim, I don't care if it was the Moscow Daily newspaper. Did she make it all up? I said, is it true? And he wouldn't answer me, so I insisted on telling him my experience with Unification Church. He didn't want to listen, but I made him. And then I said at the conclusion of of what I had to tell him that God didn't need any part of Reverend Moon's largesse to build his kingdom. And that's when Tim told me he had accepted no money from Unification Church. And the article and the context of the letter was clearly a thank you letter for an extremely generous contribution.
Oh.
And I asked him, when Tim said that, he said the liberal-controlled Washington Post refused to give ACTV, it was American Coalition for Traditional Values, any publicity. He said, so I contacted Bohe Pack, who arranged for a series of articles to appear in the Washington Times, and I was writing to thank him for those articles. Now, clearly, every reference in that article was financial, referring to how expensive things were, and it looked like he was priming the pump to even get another contribution.
Well, and I do have a copy of that article, and he says there to his friend Bohe that as soon as he got settled in his new house, as soon as they were properly moved in, they wanted Bohe and Mrs. Bohe Pack to come over and have dinner.
Right.
So it was not a casual acquaintance at all.
No, it was not. And Bohe Pack had been showing up at a number of things. And I honestly think that nobody in the Christian community would have had the courage to have brought that out at the time it was brought out, and that God used Mother Jones magazine to reveal what we had to know. In fact, to her credit, the reporter, and it's been a long time since I've read this, but she said she wasn't inferring by this that there were connections between the average fundamentalist and Unification Church. She said, to the contrary, she said, your average fundamentalist would view Bohe Pack as an altar boy to the Antichrist, which is pretty accurately describes what he is.
Yes. Yeah.
At least an Antichrist, whoever it is. You'd think nobody would want that job with all of its biblical connotations, but there's folks out there in the New Age community fighting over which one's going to get to be the Antichrist.
Yeah, and it's a title they covet, isn't it?
Sure is.
It really is. Well, you know, you've also got, I've got some Church Universal and Triumphant ties, you know, that Elizabeth Clare's Prophets group came out of the Theosophical movement.
It certainly did.
And and they do channeling of ascended masters and everything that the Lucis Trust. Oh, we'll be right back, folks. Sitting in for Chuck Morse tonight, our guests are Constance Cumby and Jed Brown, and we're talking about the radical center, where it leads in politics and religion and education, it is the 21st century. We need a bridge to it. Clinton says he'll lead us there. The right and the left are both working to take us there. They're all meeting in the middle of a big circle called the radical center. And something I'd like to bring up that fits in with what Connie said, and it's a good segue to bring in Jed Brown, who can discuss it from an education point of view, is I had a newspaper article from the New York Times that was a few years old that was about the reorganization of Moon's Washington Times newspaper and how they were going to bring it more mainstream. And it identified two interesting things. In a Moon-owned newspaper owned by the Unification Church, the Lord of the Second Advent, a senior vice president of it is Ronald Godwin, who was formerly the senior vice president of the Moral Majority with Jerry Falwell. And interestingly enough, he was back in the 70s with Jerry Falwell's university, I believe it's Liberty University, and he was the director of their lifelong learning program. Now he's working for Reverend Moon at the conservative, with quotation marks around it, Washington Times.
Interestingly on that, Shay, Ron Godwin was one of those who did speak out and condemn those who would join Unification Church and make common cause with them on projects for a price. And then they offered him a salary that was high enough, and Ron Godwin succumbed to the temptation and went to work full-time for Reverend Moon.
You know, for people who talk about accountability all the time, there is no accountability with these people when they do this, is there? They don't have there is no rational explanation for what they do beyond greed and a desire for power.
I think it's very important that we pray for those in a position of leadership in the Christian world, that they do stand strong and withstand this temptation.
Oh, absolutely. And we have to remember anybody can repent at any time.
Right.
But some accountability is necessary.
I hope that they would repent and come out and tell the horror stories that must have occurred, the pressures that were put on them to either be silent or to convert to Unification Church. Because if Ron Godwin and some of the others would emerge and tell it like it really is, they could probably save many innocent people.
Well, you know, they're promoting it. I mean, if you're on the Republican website for Washington State, it leads you to the Washington Times. Conservative equals Christian in the minds of many people, even though we know that that's not true. Another thing that New York Times article brought out is that the highest-ranking Unification Church member on the editorial staff was a woman named Josette Shiner. Bohai Pack is the managing director or the highest official at the paper. Obviously, he is the highest-ranking Unification Church member in this nation. Josette Shiner would probably have come under him as a high one. She just resigned her position with the Washington Times last September to take over her new position. She is now of Empower America. And so Bill Bennett, Mr. Character Education, is working very closely with her and with the Christian community. We'll be right back, folks. Back, America. This is Chuck Morris. We've got a caller, and I happen to know him. He's Bill Calagonis. He's a teacher and a researcher. Hi, Bill.
Hi, Shay. It's nice to talk to you again.
It's good to talk to you, too. What do you think?
Well, I have the highest respect for Walter Martin. I find it difficult to believe what Connie said about him. So,
sad but true. Sad but true and far worse. He also advocated Christian hypnosis
What's
and
that?
Christian hypnosis. The hypnosis was okay in the hands of a Christian practitioner. Acupuncture. I have the tapes, and I discussed them with him personally. The Genesis flood didn't cover the entire earth, and I remember he was very mocking on that one when we finally did meet for lunch in 1987. I hate to say this, Bill, and I admire your work very highly. This is the first time I've talked to you, but I've admired you from afar on the Internet and your
Thank you.
Internet site. You've done some extremely valuable research and made some amazing correlations. But the word on the New Age movement got out absolutely no thanks to Walter Martin whatsoever. It got out over his active opposition and attempted obstruction.
I tell you, I mean, it was common knowledge that the New Age existed.
Exactly, and I stumbled onto it accidentally back in 1981 and took 7 years out of my practice to try to expose it. And, you know, I've thought, I'm a lawyer.
I remember in the 70s people knew about it.
I'm a lawyer and a good one. And I'm thinking that they ridiculed me and marginalized me so terribly much. And I'm wondering what would have happened if I had been a housewife that said I discovered this as part of my research. They probably would have shut me down the first hour.
Well, let me ask you, and I don't know how to put this because, you know, I'm listening to you, and I don't know how to, I mentioned to Kelly on ICQ, I says, you know, I can tell that she's telling, you know, she's speaking from her heart, she's telling the truth. But I tell you, I heard Martin speak in person, and he, to me, was like a member of my family. I could have cried when the man died. I felt so bad.
Well, that weekend that he died was one of the hardest weekends of my life. I had just seen his book, The New Age Cult, and it was published by Bethany Fellowship. And one of the things he had ridiculed me for the most over the years was saying that Jim Jones was part of the New Age movement. And his book, The New Age Cult...
Wait. I would like to see that because I'll tell you what. I mean, you're talking about something that is objective.
Right.
And I can actually refer to it.
If I could go on now, in his book, and this is the reason why that weekend was difficult for me. Okay. I looked at his book, The New Age Cult, and in that book, he said that he was the first person who had brought out the occult connections of Jim Jones. It was almost like a mocking, just like the luncheon I had had with him. It was so hard for me that not only my material was generously copied in that book, but then the thing that he had given me the most trouble on, and had given me trouble on in writing even, and on his radio interviews, he and his friend John Warwick Montgomery 2 months in a row gave me his Legal Loon of the Month award. But the thing that Martin in that book said he was the first that had brought out the occult connections of Jim Jones.
You know,
and of course that book was dated, 1989 was the date on that book, and my book came out in 1983.
And that's the proof of it. When you look at copyrights and see who really did get the information first.
Okay, well, maybe I didn't listen closely enough, but I thought you had said earlier, Connie, that he denied that the New Age even existed.
He said denied it even existed. He said it existed only as a space between Constance Cumby's ears. And the first time I had admired Walter Martin so terribly deeply. I had read his book, Kingdom of the Cults.
Absolutely.
And in 1983, before Hidden Dangers maybe it was shortly after Hidden Dangers was released. But he was in town speaking, and I remember I had a phone call and said that Walter Martin had just been interviewed on WMUZ, the station where I currently do a weekly radio program. And he was asked specifically about my work, and he called me a rip-off and an alarmist. I remember it was one of the blackest days of my life. I sat down and cried, and I'd never met Walter Martin. And when they brought me out to El Toro with the Evangelical Ministries to New Religions, I was brought out there as an attempted setup. It backfired on them. And then they organized their conference in Denver on March 14th, 15th of 1985, supposedly as an evangelical conference to fight the New Age movement. It was really to fight me. And in 1987, somebody came into his office to have lunch with his secretary. He had a new secretary who was working out, and the sister came in with a newsletter, and she'd cited my book, and she had the newsletter. Walter Martin looked at it and then spoke critically about the fact that she'd praised me in there. And Walter Martin said that I was paranoid. I saw conspiracies under every tree.
Much like Grotius or Grotius did.
And the Joni, his secretary, then said, well, I was involved in the New Age movement. I came to the Lord after I read Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow. And that's when Walter Martin said, I know there's a rift between Constance Cumby and I. I was given disinformation by the 23 researchers on my staff, and I don't know how to heal it. And Joni offered to be the peacemaker, and a luncheon was set up for us in Tacoma, Washington, back in 1987. In fact, on my way to the station, Walter Martin said the dinosaurs weren't created by God, that was a result of Satan tampering with the DNA code. We were listening to that on the radio with his interview. And over lunch, he had brought 3 men with him, and thankfully I'd taken a couple witnesses with me too. But he was very mocking, and it was a grilling type episode. And he kept cupping his hands and demanding that I'd look at him. And he kept going, Connie, look at me, Connie. What's the matter, Connie? Are you afraid I'm trying to hypnotize you, Connie? It was very mocking. It was a real experience. And finally, I confronted him with something that does appear, and this is also verifiable in the earlier editions of Kingdom of the Cults. And he said on pages 14 and 15 of the earlier editions that Jesus came to show us by his example that there was such a thing as divine humanity. And I confronted Walter with that statement, and I was just sure he'd say I'd taken him out of context. That referred to...
We'll be right back. You can finish that thought in a moment. This is Shay Simonton sitting in for Chuck Morse. We've got our guests, Constance Cumby and Jed Brown, and we're talking about the changing images of man, the bridge to the 21st century, the paradigm shift, and the radical center. What does it all mean? We've been covering the radical center of politics and religion, and Constance has shared some of her personal experiences and a lot of her research in determining certain radical centers that are uncomfortable for a lot of us. Now I'd like to bring Jed Brown in. He's an educator from Washington State. He is the most grounded researcher in education as far as putting it all together. He's an educator with 4 years of experimental psychology from Colorado State University. When he decided that what was being done to lab rats was not appropriate for doing to our children, he switched his major, moved to Washington State, got his degree in education here, and got his master's at the University of Washington, and then how fortuitously he went down to Stanford University for some post-grad work about 10 years after this Changing Images of Man was released by the Stanford Research Institute. He had no awareness that this was going on, but he is a made-to-order change agent who is not a change agent. And given his educational background, his clear sight is really important for all of us. He's been working on a book that is not a leftist book, it's not a liberal book, it's not a conservative book. It is just a book that explains where it all came from, why it's here, education reform. Jed, what is the paradigm shift? What are we dealing with?
Well, hi, Shay. First, let me say that I'm glad you said that I was not a change agent. We got to make that clear. And hi, Connie.
Hi, Jed.
I know you by reputation and to speak with you or listen to you, and you've educated me in the last hour. The paradigm shift. It's interesting. Basically, it's something that people, it's a buzzword that that is used a lot that most people really don't even understand what it is. And a paradigm basically is just a model that can be reproduced. And so it can be a new model it can be a model for anything, a model for society, or a model for man, or in the case of education, a new model for education. And that's what the shift in the paradigm is all about, the shifting to a new model for man, a new model for society, and a new model for education. The term paradigm comes from a gentleman by the name of Thomas Kuhn, who wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolution.
Right.
It's a rather dry book, but he goes into it, and he says that a paradigm shift, if you're going to shift the paradigm, you're changing the actual fundamentals of whatever it is you're dealing with. And if you look up fundamentals, the fundamentals of something are what make that item what it is. And so if we change the fundamentals, we're changing the whole thing. We're rearranging it so that it is no longer what it used to be, but it's something completely new and different. And in reference to what Shay was talking about earlier, this Stanford study, the changing images of man, they reference Thomas Kuhn, and then they go on to say that the paradigm can only exist if there's a shared commitment to certain beliefs. In other words, and then they say too that the people going along with the new paradigm must share relevant values, and that leads into education from the standpoint that later in that study, see, most of us people have our values and our moral beliefs pretty well set. At least I come up on 50 years old this next week, and my values are pretty well set. So the children have become the very focal point of this bridge to the 21st century. In fact, the bridge is actually education. Hitler proved that within one generation we could turn society on its heels. And what the study from Stanford does say that, and I'll quote, that the new paradigm is often fully accepted only with a new generation, and that's what they're looking at, to train the new generation in a new paradigm, to create a new image of man out of our children, which is, in my estimation, real despicable that they go after our babies. But that's the way they're going to do it. Shay also mentioned the radical center and how the right and the left are both bringing this about. And we see that insofar as the moral education of children in the schools. There is moral education going on in the schools. They hide it. They tend to say, no, we separate religion, church, and state, and all of that. But they're training our kids morally for the 21st century. The left, from the left, we have what's called moral reasoning, and that really follows through with humanism. And so we have the right, the Christian right, getting very upset about all the humanist values and stuff that are going into the schools, is to train children in moral reasoning. In other words, they have to develop humanistic moral principles, then be given moral situations that they can analyze, and then come to conclusions about moral conduct based on those principles, those humanist principles. From the right, then, we have another aspect of moral education, which is education for virtue. And that's a Bill Bennett buzzword, virtue. And what that really is moral conduct, is what they're talking about there. And so we have character education coming in from the right. So we have both sides of the radical center, coming to the radical center, moral reasoning from a humanist vein, along with certain character traits or values that are being put forth as far as moral conduct. Those would be things like respect and responsibility, honesty, patience, tolerance is a big one, those types of things. So we have both right and left working on our children at the same time.
What I find interesting about Bill Bennett's book that is so widely touted by the conservatives and the Christian right. It's very strongly pushed in the political Christian communities. Is they're basically bedtime stories with morals, and in fact, it's a series I understand on PBS, and he draws very strongly from mythology. So he uses pagan mythology to teach Christian and Jewish children and all children virtue, which I understand is basically a Greek word from the it's definitely from a non-Christian perspective. Using pagan mythology to teach Christian virtues is a real...
Could I jump in for just 1 minute?
Sure.
Okay. I don't know if your guest knows it. He probably does, but Lucis Trust itself, which is heart and center of the New Age movement, effusively praised Frank Goebel and character education and spoke of the vital link displayed in the plan in their book. I believe it was Running God's Plan. It may have been in Things to Come, but I believe it was in Running God's Plan by Foster Bailey, who was Alice Bailey's husband. And it's there was a book in the Christian community that neutralized the Christian community on this very heavily, and the book was by Virginia Gow, and the book was called Yes, Virginia, There Is Right and Wrong. And the book contained endorsements by many leading New Age figures, and basically it was using the way of the Tao, the character ed as the bridge to get the Christian Bob Simon, I believe, is Robert Simon.
Yes.
Simons has been promoting a character ed and Frank Goebel. So I don't know if they're aware of it or not, but it is a very clear, pronounced bridge. And again, like you say, the radical center.
Yeah, we're seeing it everywhere, aren't we?
Mm-hmm.
We're finding constitutionalists basically wanting to change all the school governance and funding mechanisms directly away from the traditional thing, which is what conservatives used to be, was traditional. And Jed can speak to that and explain
doing a beautiful job.
More about the paradigm shift and why we're in it. Basically, out of this changing images of man, it is that they identified back in the early 70s that we would be moving to a post-industrial economy. And because this is a very capitalist, materialist world, economics really run everyone's agenda. Jed, would you speak about that?
Yeah, what we're doing when they talk about post-industrialists, of course that would be for the industrialized world, we're shifting to this global economy, which is a nice euphemism for redistributing production and consumption throughout the world. In other words, as we move further into the 21st century, we have a lot of third world countries and underdeveloped countries that they're in what we're entering into is the new economic order, and that order they will get production, the ability to produce, and that's why we see NAFTA and GATT, why we see our factories and our factory jobs going to the third world countries. That gives them an economic base at which point they can become consumers too. And so the entire world is being shifted into this consumer society. When you do that, unfortunately, the United States, because we consume far more of the world's resources than any other country, our consumption must go down. And so they talk about a new scarcity, and this new scarcity is the emphasis behind it in the schools becomes environmentalism. We must conserve, we must do more with less, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And so this new economic order, when you shift the economic order, all the other institutions of man begin to shift too. So you have not only a new economic order, you have a new governmental order because the old national order will not protect multinational corporations. And then you have a new social order and a new cultural order, a new moral order, and a new educational order. So all those things go to make up the new world order as they talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Jed, would you explain how the curriculum shift that people who research education attribute it to William Spady? I'm wondering if Spady read this book, The Changing Images of Man, because it lines up that they need to change man by addressing various aspects of his life, and they're doing it very strongly in the education reform.
Well, sure. There again, if we go back and look at Spady's, what he called the complex life roles, and we've shifted from a knowledge-based curriculum to a role-based curriculum, where now instead of imparting knowledge, teachers who are called facilitators now are facilitating behavior change within children so that they will fit into certain life roles that have been thought up, and Spady did come up with those life roles, although he had help. It goes back to the 20s or so. Hilda Taba and many of the people at Columbia Teachers College. But these life roles are the citizen, which goes along with the political order, the family member, which goes along with the social order, and we're talking there about global family. And the cultural order, you have the consumer as the life role. The moral order, we get into the life role of the individual. The educational order, the life role of the learner, and the economic order, the life role of the producer.
Well, Jed, we'll have to cut off there, and we'll be right back. Welcome back, America. This is Shay Simonson sitting in for Chuck Morse tonight. Our guests are Constance Cumby and Jed Brown. And Jed was just going through the paradigm shift in education. We're away from a knowledge-based system. We're going into a role-based system, and he was going over what the new roles for the new citizen for the 21st century is. It's the changing image of man, and Jed, will you pick up where you left off?
Yeah, I probably should back up just a little bit and talk about the fact that a knowledge-based system like we used to have was driven by subjects and disciplines and subjects, and it's the type of education that most of us, at least 50 years old or over, were educated with. This new system, as I say, is role-based, which means that no longer is knowledge the important factor, and they're not trying to impart knowledge. What they're trying to do is change attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors. And the way they do that, of course, through behavior modification or the old Skinnerian model. And so what we end up with is we will end up with children who have come through this system who will be tailor-made for this new world order of the 21st century. And one of the things that we could talk about, the curriculum, is difficult. It's difficult to spot what's going on because they use what's called an integrated curriculum. I call it an integrated program because curriculum actually deals with knowledge by definition. And the program in the schools is, as I say, not knowledge-based, but it is integrated. So many of these new beliefs and whatnot are coming through, say, literature. One of the big examples if we're going to talk about the moral order and moral decisions, would be a book called The Giver, which has been used throughout the United States as young as, I believe, 4th grade. Children who are not capable of reading it have it read to them. I don't recommend the book from the standpoint, I don't want to give the woman, Lois Lowry, the author, any more money, but it's something that you should go to the library and check out. It deals with topics like euthanasia, and actually birth mothers, assigned roles in society and whatnot. These topics out of this book then create a moral situation, if you will, that can be discussed in class after the teacher has presented the values or principles upon which the discussion will take place. And those principles are generally humanistic principles. And Connie may be able to talk more adequately to the principles behind humanism than I can. But what we see in the curriculum, if we sort it through, is things like tolerance and kindness, self-denial, open-mindedness. We have this whole thing of self-actualization that comes through the curriculum. We get into pantheism and evolutionism and transcendentalism. Those aspects of the curriculum. Those are the behaviors and beliefs, if you will, that they're trying to instill in children now as we go into the new moral order. So, and we could talk about the other orders too, but being that we're on the moral frame, that might be more valuable to people.
It would certainly cause a conflict around the dinner table at night, wouldn't it? When parents who are educated in the old way and have set, fixed moral beliefs are confronted with children who've been facilitated in the classroom and told by their teachers that what their parents believe may be right for them, but it doesn't mean that you have to blindly follow what your parents' beliefs are. And
in fact, you can't follow blindly, because if you're following blindly, you're not thinking for yourself.
Right, and furthermore, it becomes even more potent when the children are told to journal.
Right.
What takes place, what is said, and what is done at home, and when the definition of abuse is being extended to mental abuse
And, you know, it's being done in Christian schools, too. A child I'm very close to was telling me her parents are paying $500 a month for her to go to quite a fundamentalist evangelical Christian school, very prominent here in the Seattle area. And she said that they're getting stress management in school. She's a freshman in high school, and they are to keep a journal of all their stresses and how they deal with them. And so you're not saving your children from anything.
I think I'd instruct my children to write down, I find keeping this journal extremely stressful.
I happen to be very close to this child's mother, and she said, basically, this is BS, lie, and that's what she instructs her child to do.
But the children also, many times, they're instructed not to tell their parents what they're studying in the group, but that's a form of betrayal to the group.
One of the things that we should probably bring out, too, is the journals they serve another aspect of this new program, in that as you change the economic order, as you start changing the moral order, so forth, all these different new images of man, people have a tendency to become alienated.
I certainly am.
And alienation is this feeling of estrangement and whatnot. That Marx years ago wrote that if that alienation gets to be too great, that mankind will revolt and bring in the class of society. His prediction of the class of society was off, but his analysis of people and alienation, I think, was right on. And so what these journals do is that as a child writes, the teacher can read through them and see how much alienation that child is experiencing, and then they know, whether to go ahead or slow down, so forth, with some of the things they're doing. So because they don't want children to be too alienated. One of the things, Connie, I'm going to ask you about, as long as I've got you here, is I use the term humanism. Is that term synonymous with the New Age? Or
no, it's not. In fact, I've really have really cautioned people to use that term. It's almost been a term that's been thrown out there almost as a red herring to divert the Christian community from the New Age. When they were in there screaming about humanism and being marginalized for it, the New Age is in there making tremendous inroads and distinguishing themselves from the humanists by emphasizing their, quote, spiritual aspect, unquote.
And that is the Findhorn, the guy that is advocating Findhorn. Basically, what they practice is animism and that God is in everything, and that there are all these spirits, that if you tune into spirits, that's what Thompson advocates as the best model.
There is something they call cosmic humanism.
Okay.
That's out there, and transformational outcome-based education, and those are all terms for the mysticism of the New Age.
All right.
But there's basically humanism is a belief that it's all up to man.
Oh, and man can't do it. Just can't do it, Lord.
And the New Age plugs into something that you shouldn't use to do it.
Okay, folks, we'll be right back. Welcome back, America. This is Shay Simonton sitting in for Chuck Morse. Our topic tonight is the bridge to the 21st century, paradigm shifts, and what we're doing about it, how we're being led across the bridge, who is leading us across the bridge, all those good things. Are they good things? Are you alienated? I'm alienated. We're going to open up our lines for phone calls. Direct your questions to Constance Cumby and Jed Brown. Our number is 800-290-4868. And before the phones start ringing, I'd like to go over some of the guidelines and strategies for the changing image of man put out by Stanford University in 1974. The first point is that in order to have a non-catastrophic transition to a post-industrial economy, we must promote awareness of the unavoidability of the transformation. Number 2, construct a guiding version of a workable society. Number 3, foster a period of experimentation and tolerance for diverse alternatives. Number 4, encourage a politics of righteousness and a heightened sense of public responsibilities in the private sector. Anybody for multinational corporations, public-private partnerships? Number 5, promote systematic exploration of and foster education regarding man's inner life, his spirituality. And 6, accept the necessity of social controls for the transition period while safeguarding against longer-term losses of freedom. That sounds very ominous on the American Freedom Network. Connie?
Yeah.
I don't know if you've got a copy of this book. I'd certainly like to send you one. I think you'd find it very interesting.
That sounds interesting.
And
Please do.
Willis Harman is a name you may be familiar with.
Indeed.
And he was the driving force of this book.
What book is that now?
It's called The Changing Images of Man.
Okay, that was the book that Marilyn Ferguson based much of her the Aquarian Conspiracy upon. But no, I do not have a copy of The Changing Images of Man. I wish I did.
Well, I happen to have copied it for research.
Okay.
And I would be happy. Jed, because of his UW alumni card, was able to check it out, and we did make a copy. And frankly, I find it absolutely disgusting, and naturally, that makes it really juicy, and I would love to send it on to you, and I'll do that.
All right. By the way, Willis Harman is a secular humanist. He would be, if he was into any form of humanism, it would be the cosmic humanism. He's a very dedicated esotericist.
Right.
Now, he was good friends, too, with Barbara Marx Hubbard, wasn't he?
And Marilyn Ferguson, Barbara Marx Hubbard, Jean Houston, he was close to all of them. Edgar Mitchell, the former astronaut, who formed the Institute of Noetic Sciences that Willis Harman was heading. And SRI, of course, Willis Harman was a big man at for many years.
And of course, we find the cosmic humanist viewpoint expounded in all the UNESCO education materials, too.
Yes, well, they had another prayer partner, and I'm spelling pray in the sense of Prey.
Oh, I love it.
A prayer partner in the form of Robert Mueller, who was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, and coordinated the work of 37 agencies at the UN, including very prominently UNESCO. And they had a very direct input up there. Donald Keyes, who I wrote of in Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow, boasted that he spent his time roaming the halls of the United Nations, writing speeches for the ambassadors, and that he had started many a trend at the UN by writing a speech for the first ambassador, and then a speech for the second ambassador, thanking the first ambassador for the speech he had just delivered. And but so there was a very conscious, self-conscious group of New Agers up at the United Nations who had a free ride and were able to implement their agenda. And then Norman Cousins was giving dinner parties for those ambassadors. Donald Keyes, who was an administrator of Lucis Trust, same one I mentioned in conjunction with Frank Goebel in the character ed, was telling him which ambassadors to invite, and they did a terrible amount to put the New Age as a paradigm shift for that group of internationalists a very long time ago.
And what we find, too, then, is all this stuff filtering through UNESCO and the United Nations and then coming back into this country under the guise of, at least in education.
Right. By the way, Robert Mueller is an active member of Lucis Trust. It is Harmon and Keyes, is our Harmon and Keyes. And Robert Mueller claimed to be the father of outcome-based education. He said, but he could not take exclusive credit for it. He had to give credit where credit was due. And credit was due to the Tibetan master Jewel Cole, and that was the entity that Alice Bailey claimed was channeling through her to write the books which came from Lucis Trust.
And now, doesn't he channel Jewel Cole himself?
Well, I don't know if he channels it or not. I don't know, but he certainly claimed that that was his source of inspiration. My observation is they seem to rely on Alice Bailey, that's their printed scriptures.
Now, here is a radical center example. Jay Gary is promoting this 2000 celebration for supposedly as a birthday for Jesus.
Yeah, he and Robert Mueller together.
And Robert Mueller,
just the two of them,
who wants the global spirituality and promotes Lucis Trust, are apparently working and interacting with each other on this.
Right, and another interesting tie that's there that tied into much that your other guest, Dr. Brown, had to say is the Pew Charitable Trust, who have been funding many of these dialogues for the Christian community through Christianity Today.
And Pew is considered a conservative group. It represents Sun Oil, I believe.
Save me, yes. Okay.
Yeah. We'll be right back. This is Shay Simonton sitting in for Chuck Morse. Another item out of this book from Stanford Research Institute called The Changing Images of Man that I'd like to mention because I found it fascinating. This study was done, funded by the Kettering Foundation in 1974, and at that time there were a lot of liberal groups. The Green Movement was getting started, the feminist movement was getting started. There had been a lot of protests over the war. Watergate was going on. There were many liberal grassroots groups starting out on a variety of issues. The right was not particularly organized at that time, aside from some intensely involved Republicans. And the churches were not involved at all. Religion stayed clear of politics at that time, if I remember correctly. Well, this book identifies a type of structure that it says is an ideal model for the global village. And it mentions a lot of liberal groups of environmentalists and things that were networking then. It was part of the Aquarian Conspiracy, liberal groups networking together. Since 1974, we've seen this kind of thing going on the conservative side. And the group is called, it's a model, it's a paradigm, it's called a spin. This is a sociological term. SPIN stands for segmented polycephalic...
Polycentric.
Polycephalus is actually it. Many brains. Polyencephalus network. So it is a group consisting of many brains, i.e., in my mind, I'm putting in global brain, that all network together.
You're giving the Gerlach and Hines definition that I think Marilyn Ferguson quoted in the Aquarian Conspiracy, and I thought she'd called it an SPIN, segmented polycentric many centers.
That's it.
She referred to it integrated networks, or spins.
That's it. It's the spin, and it's the model that subsequently the conservatives and the churches went to, where you have grassroots groups networking and affiliated with national groups. It says there is a great deal of interaction between leaders of cells. Each cell would be a segment in the movement structure, which may link a few local groups to a close association or connect with hundreds of groups across the country in loose and indirect ways. Frequently, the leader of one group will be a follower member in another group.
Right. Then the reason they were going to succeed this time, Shay, whereas in the past they had failed, per Miss Ferguson, was that now modern communications had encircled the world beyond any possibility of retreat. That they had with fax machines and computers, instant communication.
Yeah. Well, and it identifies, it says the type of linkage is a ritual activity. Rallies, demonstrations, marches, conferences, revival meetings, joint activities of some sort or another.
Sounds like promise keepers.
Now, Jeremy Rifkin, and I'm glad you brought that up, Dr. Brown. Jeremy Rifkin wrote a very important book called The New Emerging Order, God in an Age of Scarcity. And he said that the primary instrument to bring the new order to birth impulse was strong enough to finally do that job would be the Protestant Church, that the evangelicals would supply the new covenant vision, the charismatics liberating energy.
Oh, thank you for that, Connie. We'll be right back and discuss that further. Good evening, America. This is Shay Simonson filling in for Chuck Morse tonight. He's taking the evening off to celebrate Rosh Hashanah, and he's asked me to sit in for him. And I hope you'll bear with me. I've never done this before, and I've got my fingers crossed that the focus on this. What's going on?
Well, I think that the whole way that they have come up with to change society, to bring people to this radical center, is to pit the extremes against one another and have managed crises. And so what we have now in the White House is in a sense, coming out of the White House is a national crisis. We have a moral crisis, just like we had an education crisis back 15 years ago. I would suspect now that what we'll see is a great deal of debate. I doubt, of Clinton will leave office or be impeached. I don't think that that's really the purpose of it. I think it was to spark the debate on moral issues, on ethical issues, and we'll have the right coming at it, and we see Bill Bennett all over the television of late, and then we'll have the New Age aspects coming in, and the great debate pursuing about how we're going to set ethical standards in this country, and that will be eventually the consensus that we come to as a country, the new ethical standards, which will pull from the right and from the left, just like they're doing in education.
Yeah, that might be it. There's another scenario that's very possible. The New Agers have been saying for years that Al Gore would be their first New Age president. And I think that Clinton's character defects were known when he went in there.
Oh, sure.
The New Agers have been saying they're going to be the phoenix that arises from the ashes and that it has to come from chaos. They don't necessarily want managed crisis. They're convinced they're going to emerge from any crisis. Crisis equals opportunity, is their belief. And all revolutions eat their children. And this revolution is probably no exception. These days, whoever out New Ages the last one gets there. But Al Gore, Clinton plays around with it. Al Gore is a dedicated ideologue, and he's going to look very moral.
Yeah.
Next to Bill Clinton, if there is an impeachment.
But
I don't know if there will
pinning
be or
it on not the fact that he did what he did. It's the lie that they're trying to pin.
But it was basically, like newsflash, politician has affair. Double newsflash, politician asks girl not to talk about affair. And triple newsflash, politician denies affair. I mean, what else is new? He wasn't the first. He probably won't be the last. And this has been going on in Washington. They're probably very known. And it's basically, we really have, it's almost humorous, a star chamber taking place, considering the name of the Inquisitor. And I'm wondering exactly what forces are behind this and what forces instigated it. I'm not sure I blame somebody, even if they did lie, for lying about what was really nobody's business. My own thinking on this is it's Hillary's business, and if Hillary's not going to worry about it, I'm not going to lay awake nights and worry about whether Bill was true to Hillary, and I don't think Monica can say, gee, I didn't know he was married.
What I do find fascinating, and I think Shay started to mention that, and that is that at least within the media coverage, they keep saying over and over again it's not sex. So we're in that it's the lying.
But the bigger issue even is the privacy. And suddenly we've become a police state where there's no privacy.
Sure.
And I don't know how many people have thought that if even the president is fair game for a complete invasion of privacy, what about all the rest of us?
But I do think we're being led to look at the trustworthiness or the lack of trustworthiness in our officials, as opposed to their what would be standardly considered immoral behavior from Judeo-Christian ethic, which would be the sexual aspect of it.
So the lying has been brought up. On the other hand, the invasion of privacy has bothered me far more. And when I consider where some of the people are coming from, and Jerry Falwell was a major mover and shaker on that.
He has no moral grounds to say anything.
Yeah, he's been in bed with Reverend Moon and Bohi Paca for at least the last 11 years.
The fact that the media, that is all. There are stations that do nothing but have round-the-clock coverage of this issue, as if there's nothing legislatively being passed, there is nothing occurring in the world.
The other thing that could be happening is that this could be sufficient chaos to really bring down the United States government. And that basically is the United States government is the only piece of the New World Order that's not yet in place. And if they're the chaos that emerges from the ashes, and it looks like Clinton is calling for more and more world order
in
response to the crisis.
In fact, I believe, one of the things that has been covered up by the media, or at least has not been mentioned of late, I believe this last month, the United Nations did passed their resolution to establish a world criminal court.
Yes, they certainly did. And today, indeed, as those Monica Lewinsky tapes were airing, Clinton was at the United Nations calling for the nations of the world to unite to fight terrorism.
So we're looking at creating a world where liberty is not the essential, it's security, because of the multinational corporations and whatnot.
But if you look at the United Nations guidelines, and the guidelines on this, it's a very vastly broadened set of guidelines that basically encompasses free speech as we know it in the United States, or as we used to have it before the politically correct movement.
Well, and I find there again the United Nations aspect of this interesting, because most of that which is happening in education here, as far as education restructuring, is happening throughout the world. Every country is restructuring their education system.
Yes, our outcomes-based education is very remarkably close to the UNESCO guidelines.
Yeah, pretty much through the UNESCO efforts. So it's being done all over.
And we'll go into the UNESCO guidelines on education globally as soon as we come back. If you have any questions or any comments and you'd like to call in and tell us any of your experiences with the New Age and the changing paradigm for the changing images of man, please call us at 1-800-290-4868. Connie, I've got a quote that Jed, I'd like Jed to read to you. This is from a UNESCO book on character education.
Well, actually, the book is entitled Areas of Learning, Basic to Lifelong Education, and it was put out in all the many volumes the UNESCO's put out about the new education system. And the quote, I'll just read a part of it here, Kay in 1975 calls, quote, the self-actualizing man whose conduct is characterized by this emergent moral quality of rational altruism, homo moralis. It is a vital task for an adult of today to achieve a qualitative transformation of from Homo sapien to Homo moralis. This moral quality of rational altruism may be called universal benevolence based on cosmic justice. Cosmic justice is based on the rational recognition of cosmic order.
Whose book was that, Dr. Brown?
That was out of the Areas of Learning Basic to Lifelong Education. It's a chapter they have in their own called the Ethical Domain.
Well, it sounds like they sure got carried away with the spirit of the thing. Maybe I'll suggest a new name for them, Homo Moronis.
Homo moralis. we're all going to make this giant evolutionary leap. Homo sapien to Homo moralis.
I'm afraid they're a minority in the New Age movement. My experience with so many of them is they seem to have the morals of little rabbits.
Well, it's all centered on the group, isn't it? All the group dynamics and everything like that. That the group determines the morality, and you defend the morality of the group. And isn't that basically that was central to Hitler's whole thing, wasn't it?
Yes, it's a form of fascism.
Yeah.
Actually, and the New Age was to be an age of group consciousness. I've called it group grope.
Well, too, what I noticed, too, in most of the reading that I've done is there's this shift from God's law to natural law. And so within, say, natural law for young children, or children of adolescent age, to have sexual relations would be okay, would not be immoral because it's biologically driven. And yet for them to have unsafe sex would be immoral because we wouldn't want to risk giving an STD or something like that, which is more of a natural law as opposed to God's law that says don't do it. And I find the whole moral atmosphere of the schools, at least, is going to this natural law.
Well, that's been a theme that's been around them for a very long time, and they keep resurrecting it. Of course, they'll talk about the air ebb and flow.
Well, that was what Margaret Sanger was all about, wasn't it?
Well, Margaret Sanger was a dedicated Rosicrucian. She was more than a peripheral person. She had plugged into the ideology first and seemed to come up with some of her population and elitist and eugenic ideas later.
But with this concentration on zero population ever since World War II and the baby boom, I'm finding, the sex education is the hot button issue of so many of the Christian right parents who've become involved in education have been to fight sex education curriculums. And
it really is a form of the dialectic, and although that's not to say that the sex education hasn't been a big part of the revolutionaries and the occultists whenever they've come to power. Mexico is a prominent example of that. It's such an almost what happened down there and how it culminated in a massive persecution of the Christian community, particularly from the years 1926 to 1935, and how it was accompanied by the shoving down the parents' throats of the sex education, simultaneous with the repression of Christianity. The parallels are very interesting, and the United States government finally did do something to help down there. They signed a treaty with Mexico to protect ducks, geese, and other flying fowl. So the whole thing is like an instant replay.
Well, and it's, when you go to fight it as an individual parent in the schools, when you go to your school board and try to follow the guidelines that are set out for redressing wrongs, you run into these spins, these networks of groups that network together.
Right, and Character Ed was to be the bridge that would bring both sets together. It would be the dialectic that would bridge.
Yeah, and it is a merging of both sides, isn't it? We'll come to the radical center over character. And, of course, they had to create a crisis to do that, to get people to agree. And that's one thing we're seeing played out.
I don't know if the crisis has been created or if they exploited the natural tendencies of philandering politicians. I don't know.
Well, here in Seattle, we have the situation, and it has had national press, of the teacher who had an affair with her young student who was an adolescent boy and actually had his baby, and, she was on Oprah. On the other hand, Jed had given me a newspaper clipping from several years ago that actually the state had a meeting on the State Department of Education with some community leaders and to come up with a sexual code of conduct for teachers. And the sexual code of conduct they came up with and agreed to back about in the early 90s was that it is only wrong if a teacher has sexual relations with a student in their own district. If the student is from another district, even though it's technically statutory rape. But that is the policy that was decided upon and agreed to. I sent that story, because I have the clipping, to one of the local television stations when they were covering these stories. And they frankly could not see a connection, because the story they were carrying was of a janitor who was having a sexual relationship with a student. And they couldn't see any connection at all. It was terrible that the janitor did it, but they couldn't see any kind of a thing that it's not okay for a teacher to do it.
Connie, that leads me to a question that I'd like to ask you, and that is, let me preface by saying, from my Christian standpoint, my moral base is God's law.
Right.
And what is the moral base? From where do moral decisions come from, insofar as people who have New Age beliefs? Is there a base of moral reasoning or thinking that they use?
That is the difficult part, because basically the New Age is centered upon a process, and the process is one of going within, which is the opposite of the scriptural injunction, which says, "O Lord, I know that the way of man is not within himself. It is not in man that walketh to direct his steps." That's Jeremiah 10:23. The New Age employs processes, and all these techniques, whatever they are directed to lead somebody into an interior path, and basically everything is good for you in the New Age, but Orthodox Judaism, Orthodox Christianity, and fundamentalist Islamic religion even is considered bad for you, even though the Sufism, which is an interior, and various forms of mystic Christianity are considered good for you. And they go inside. I am really convinced, the more I've looked at this, that we are looking at a movement of mass possession, particularly when one of the common experiences that they report, and Marilyn Ferguson herself told me this, confessed this personal sympathy to me, that one of the things they start worrying about is the fate of Lucifer. And I really think that they're plugged into something that's not of themselves. They can't explain it. It's not of God. But because they can't explain it away, and it's more powerful than anything they've ever experienced, in a sense, they've tasted the forbidden fruit that the Lord said, don't touch. And I tell them I'm not smart enough to second-guess God. But these folks think that they because they have experienced that they know that this is God. They're listening to what those voices are saying to them, and there are some mixed things that are said, and basically it's centered on people having an interior experience or driving them through various means to where they're forced to seek an interior experience. And their codes, such as they are, come from there. There is no central moral point.
I see. Okay, and so this whole thing of becoming would be...
It's becoming, the process itself, and anything that leads you to that process. Now, one of the things that Mark Satin wrote back in his New Options newsletter in 1985 was the New Temperance would be a very vital link in the launching of the New Age. And indeed, if I talked about the history earlier in this century, I don't know if you were online at that point or not, but many prominent theosophists were active in the temperance movement. Why their interest? One thing, it was a very important wedge issue to split the Catholic and the Protestant communities, and so they Romanism, rum and ruin. And people did not see what was taking place, what was shaping up in the fascist movements and the mysticism that was undermining the Russian government and played an important part in its fall, and the mysticism that helped set up the structure in Germany. People were just utterly anesthetized to it by the process itself. Wow. And meanwhile, the Christian community was diverted with these moral issues, and the temperance movement, which many theosophists were highly involved with. And similarly today, the anti-smoking, much of the anti-smoking movement, and I've never had a cigarette in my life, never been tempted to. I think it's a filthy, dirty habit. However, this new Puritanism on it, much of it is the New Age, which really wants a license to regulate and to tell people how to live their life, and again, drive people. If anything's going to drive a number of these smokers to meditation for inner peace, it's going to be to take away their
Well, all of basically the therapies, not all of them, but a lot of them, to help people overcome substance addictions, involve New Age techniques, don't they?
Well, basically they believe I'm dysfunctional. You're dysfunctional unless you've gone through these 12-step groups to admit your dysfunctionality, that you're dysfunctional too, and yet you're in denial. And basically, this is one of the very important initiation spots to the New Age.
You know, it's funny. I'd like to go back and pick up on something you said about New Age people, that you surmise that they are in reality following an external being Lucifer.
Well, they are plugged into something. In fact, Lucifer the more deeply they get into their interior experiences, the more sympathy they seem to have for Lucifer.
What I find fascinating is that always down through the history of education, when we look at logos of like major universities and whatnot, they always had the torch as their logo, or the lamp of knowledge. And when the U.S. Department of Education was created back in 1978, they put together a logo, and it is the tree of knowledge. And the only place I'm aware of that being in literature is in Genesis, where it's the one thing we're told to stay away from. And that gave me sort of a tip-off as to where a lot of this education stuff was coming from, and it wasn't from a good source.
Right.
And it was the Department of Education in '68 that set up the Stanford Research Institute as one of their institutes.
A very important book for understanding some of the inroads on this is Jean Houston's book, A Mythic Life, where she probably gave away a great deal more than she intended to. But she talked about how in 1974, she based, sometime in the 70s during the Carter administration, she had the whole U.S. government under a trance, almost key governmental officials.
Hold that thought. We'll come back and discuss Jean Houston's book right after this message.
Update. Today, much of the nation.
This is Shay Simonson, filling in for Chuck Morse. My guests tonight are Constance Cumby and Jed Brown. And Connie, you were telling us about a book by Jean Houston.
Yes.
Would you complete that?
Well, the book is A Mythic Life. It's the autobiography of Jean Houston. And she really boasts about the influence she's had in many spheres, including religion, including politics, and one very notable affair she talked about during the 1970s that she said she had literally the entire United States government in a New Age trance at a mandatory seminar for key governmental officials in Virginia, I believe it was, Maryland or Virginia, and while the President Carter was in office. Her access to the White House did not start with the Clinton administration. And she gives away a great deal of conscious influence, and that this has been going on for a very, very long time, although it did not even start with Jean Houston there. Those influences were there during the earlier years that I talked about, during the Roosevelt administration, and even earlier, as early as the Wilson administration. And I guess the key difference is the New Agers between those administrations and currently is that now they believe that modern communications have encircled the world beyond any possibility of retreat. That during the days of the Carter administration, they couldn't telegraph everything around the world with an instant fax or an instant computer punch. Now they can.
Well, it is true that the networking that goes on the Internet is incredible, and it's been very valuable to me.
Oh, extremely.
Don't know that it will stay a viable option very long.
I don't know how long it will. I had people ask me on my own radio program with their noses closed what I thought of Christians who use the Internet and computers, and I told them computers are a fact of life. They're probably here to stay, and I said, so is the Internet. I said, if they're going to communicate with the fax machines and computers, I'm not going to use tom-toms and tin cans. But besides, I need to be on there watching so I know when it's time to boogie on out.
Well, one thing it does that I've noticed is it's a great leveler, because a talented person can put up an absolutely beautiful, impressive website.
Well, one of the best I've seen on the Internet was Bill Calagonis, who...
he's got a fantastic
I've
site.
never seen anything quite as detailed as his.
There are so many, and they are the work of individuals. They're up to the standards of any of the big political or religious or New Age groups as far as graphics and everything.
Yeah, it is a great leveler, and as long as we can stay on there and get our side of the news. They don't like that aspect too well.
Yeah, and they're using the pornography issue, which is a very serious issue on the Internet, I think, to try and put some controls on it. That it's difficult to foresee exactly what direction that will take.
On the other hand, it's also occurred to me that the World Wide Web could be truly a spider's web that we've all been enticed on, and we're all getting hopelessly hooked on it.
Well, and that is a strong possibility. I know when my computer crashes, which it did recently, I definitely have some withdrawal symptoms to deal with. So,
Fortunately, I have more than one.
I'm on the other end of it. If they ever burn down the University of Washington Library, I'll be in trouble. But no.
Books, printed books that you go and check out of a library are going to be a diminishing species, I think. At the rate that they're going. School libraries are working on cleaning out their libraries and going to internet for their information.
Well, I must say, I kind of years ago, the New Agers said one of the things they were going to do was get all the world's books on a collection of CD-ROMs, and that way they would save all these trees, and people would be able to access those books
and you would have
immediately
to
see
trust
what
their
they had to say.
translations, wouldn't you?
Well, I closed that book up. I remember it was 1981, and I was first researching the New Age movement, and I slammed the book shut that had that prophecy, and I said to my husband, I said, that's one of their better ideas. I'll get the first collection. That way I can keep up with them and clean house at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
I may have the world's first really, really serious CD-ROM collection.
Well, listen, for listeners who are on the internet and who would like to follow up, we've covered a lot of ground tonight. We've mentioned a lot of names, and we've thrown out a lot of information that you may or may not be familiar with. And we did a lot of this research, I did, on the internet. If you'd like to get a pencil and paper, I can name some of the things that we've covered, and you may want to do your own web searches. On the internet, I found an interview between Willis Harman, who was the guiding light of Stanford Research Institute's book, Changing Images of Man, and it's an interview he did with Barbara Marx Hubbard some time ago. The text of that is on the internet. If you search for Willis W. Harman, Harman, you can do a search for William Irwin Thompson, who advocates the spirituality of Findhorn. Findhorn is on the internet. You can go in. You can see the site. There are pictures on it. If you use the search word Robert Muller, Muller, member of the Lucis Trust and the author of the World Core Curriculum, you can find a lot about world peace and Millennium 2000 celebrations, and David Spangler. That's David Spangler, a major New Age influence, Spangler. You can find all the conservative spins, segmented polycephalic networks at Town Hall. They all support each other. They follow the textbook definition of the new global village model. It's called a spin, segmented polycephalic networks. Polycephalic means many brains, and the right has got them, so does the left. You can look up Marilyn Ferguson, who is the author of The Aquarian Conspiracy, the 1980 book that documented all of these paradigm shifts that we're experiencing. And I think you'll have a fascinating time. There is a lot pro and con about all these people on the internet. People need to find out for themselves. You need to find out